Hi, bitch besties. It's your main bitch, Melli. Thank you so much for tuning in and welcome to another episode of the Judgy Bitch Pod. Hi, Paige. Welcome to the Judgy Bitch Pod.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. I'm so excited to see you. It's been so long.
I know. It's so good to see you.
Yes. Tell my bitch besties how you and I know each other.
Okay, so we have a mutual friend named Shannon, and we met through her in Asbury Park. We had, some crazy adventures down there, or up there, I should say. Yeah. So it's been 6, 7 years about? Maybe a little longer?
Yeah. Asbury Park is in Jersey for all those who don't know. And you are originally from where?
I'm from right outside of Philadelphia. Shout out Delco.
Yes. And also shout out, I miss you. And today we're going to do a true crime episode about a case that happened very close to your house. How far away is it approximately?
30 minutes.
That's crazy. That's wild.
I know.
And you are a big true crime fan as well, right?
I am. I love true crime. I actually have a criminology degree. And so I've always, always had that true crime bug. But I listen to podcasts, documentaries, you name it, I know that case.
Wow.
Huge true crime fan.
I didn't know you had a degree on it. I have to have you back on here more often for some other cases.
Listen, C's and D's get degrees. I'm no expert by all means, but I love it.
Same. While we're on the topic, let's just put the disclaimer out. Everything you and I know about this case is from whatever is available publicly. Might be documentaries. There's one on Hulu that I watched. There's another one, I forgot where it was on. And we Googled and, ChatGPT gave us some information. So we are no professionals. We just know all our information from whatever we found somewhere online.
That and everything that we say is allegedly. We want no lawsuit.
I like that. Allegedly, everything. I love it. So the case we're talking about today is the Ellen Greenberg case. And let's try to go through it somewhat chronologically, but we can pause here and there, or please interrupt me if you have an additional information that I'm not aware of. Otherwise, I will just read at the beginning specifically through the details what happened, and then we can pause and discuss it. Works for you?
Yes.
Sounds good. So this happened pretty much 14 years ago, almost 15 years ago, actually, on January 26, 2011, in that neighborhood that you can pronounce.
Manayunk.
Exactly. That is close to Philadelphia or in Philadelphia?
It's like a suburbs. I don't really know. It's on the outskirts. It's Philly, but it's Manayunk, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So this woman, Ellen, was a first grade teacher. And it was said that she was struggling a little bit with her mental health. There were, in one of the documentaries I watched, there were text messages shown of her where she really seemed to be struggling with her job all of a sudden and, just struggling with depression. She was living with her fiance, Sam Goldberg, in that neighborhood in Philadelphia. And the day of January 26 was apparently a day when there was a snowstorm coming. So it was said in one of the documentaries that Ellen, even on that day, had filled up her car, which is very common for people to do when there's a storm coming. They want to be prepared just in case, So she filled up her car that day with gas, and then she went home to her fiance. He then, in the afternoon, ended up going to the building's gym while Ellen stayed at home. And that's where it actually really starts, but just, creating that background information. So when he went to the gym, around 4:50, he went to the building's gym. He was seen on the surveillance cameras in the building. 5:27, about 37 minutes later, he was seen on the surveillance cameras of the elevator bank going back upstairs to their apartment. However, he couldn't get into the apartment because apparently the latch of the door was closed from the inside. So he couldn't get in. There's a ton of phone records that show that he tried to text Ellen. He progressed to get more and more angry, like, what the fuck? Open the door. What are you doing? He just couldn't get into the apartment because of that latch being closed from the inside. Around 6:28, he was seen at the elevator again because he was going up and down in the building. I don't really know what he was doing. It took him almost an hour to figure out how to get into that apartment. And meanwhile, he was going up and down in the building. I don't know if he was going to the doorman and asking for help or whatever he was doing. He was texting her frantically and calling her.
Yeah, I think he was well, obviously he was locked out because he couldn't get into the door with the latch being, over. I think he was getting frustrated, after banging on the door, calling her, texting her. At one point, he did go down to try and have the doorman open the door, but
Yeah,
the man wasn't able to leave his post, so he actually couldn't help. And
yeah.
that's when he called to get the door broken into, and then he ended up breaking down the door himself.
So he ended up breaking down the door at 6:30. It's only 2 minutes. You must have been downstairs, took the elevator up, and immediately broke down the door. And that's also when the 911 call was received. So immediately after breaking down the door, he found Ellen on the floor in the kitchen. I think it's just like the apartment concept. You step right in and there's, an open concept. So, and then this 911 call, I have some notes on that, which was a little strange. So at first he's stuttering and says he needs help. He just walked into the apartment and his fiance is on the floor with blood everywhere. Then he was asked, where is she bleeding from? And he says, I don't know. I can't tell. And then after the operator questioned that he doesn't know where the blood is coming from, he says, I think her head. I think she hit her head. Then he says her shirt won't come off. It's a zipper. And then he says, oh my gosh, she stabbed herself. And the operator asks, where? And he says, she fell on a knife. There's a knife sticking out of her heart. What's your initial thoughts?
Okay, so if there's blood everywhere, so the way that in the documentaries they show the pictures and footage of the crime scene, if someone has a knife sticking out of their chest, you're going to notice that. Like he said that he didn't notice it right away when he first walked in, and then it wasn't until the operator told him to try and remove the jacket that he then, started to unzip it and then saw it. I'm sorry. I don't think that is necessarily the truth. I also have my thoughts about his phone call because while I cannot relate to being, in that situation, I just think that the way that he spoke and handled it kind of seemed almost like staged. He didn't seem too, I'm trying to think of the word, like reactive, or at least like what I would expect. Like I feel like, he's very calm on the phone. And then at one point, like the operator was like, are you willing to do CPR? And he's like, well, I have to, right? And I'm like,
Yeah.
that's your fiance. And you found her on the floor, unresponsive with blood everywhere. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
It just was not how I pictured, my God forbid if I'm ever in that situation, like I wouldn't want my potential fiance to react like he did.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I also found it odd that his initial reaction, and you said that you and I, we've never been in a situation like this, so we don't know how we would react under shock and everything. However, his initial reaction was she stabbed herself. My
Right.
initial
Yes.
reaction would have been somebody killed her.
Right. I know. I blanked on that. But yes, for him to like initiate the comment and say she stabbed herself. Oh no, she stabbed herself. Why would you jump to conclusions unless like you're trying to plant that seed? You know what I
Yeah,
mean? Like, oh my gosh, she
yeah,
has a knife in her chest. Like,
yeah.
oh my gosh, she, whatever, there was an accident. But for you to already say and come out and say she stabbed herself, that just it's very odd to me.
But honestly, like in no situation, when I find somebody with a knife sticking out of their chest, would I ever, it wouldn't even cross my mind, think that they did this to themselves.
Right. Yes. I mean, statistically, I think stabbing by suicide is very low. I don't know the number, so I can't,
Mhm.
say that statistic, but it's not impossible. But the likelihood of someone doing that is extremely low. Like, I just, why
Yeah,
would he jump to conclusions? Like, that's just, it's
it's so weird.
frustrating.
It is so weird.
Very.
So I don't know. I don't know how I would react, but I can, with pretty high certainty say I would not say she stabbed herself. I don't
Right.
think that would cross my mind.
No.
And as you said, it
Right.
just felt weird. The whole phone call, his whole demeanor on the call, the way he was
Yes.
like, I have to do CPR. It was just, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. Very odd.
And then they said Besides the door latch that was broken in from him, apparently, they said otherwise the apartment was not disheveled whatsoever. She must have been very OCD-like, very neat, everything in its place. The only thing was that the knife block, they have one of those blocks where multiple knives stick in. The knife block that's on the countertop was tipped over.
Yes.
So they say there is no sign of struggle. There is no sign of self-defense or anything like that.
You're right. Yeah. They also so I forget which floor she lived on, but they did have, like, a balcony, but the balcony was very small. Like, you it's not like a balcony where you can sit out. And then with the fresh snow, they said the likelihood that someone, climbed up the window and into the balcony was not likely because they would see the fresh footprints in the snow, and there was none. So,
Interesting.
I don't know.
Yeah. So the Hulu documentary is called What Happened in Apartment 609 or something like that. So I would assume it must have been on the sixth floor,
Oh,
maybe.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that would make sense.
So then it turns out that she actually had 20 stab wounds. There wasn't much of a defense struggle detected. So it must have happened very quickly and aggressively. That's what they said in one of those documentaries. However, those 20 stab wounds included 10 stab wounds in the back of her neck.
Mhm.
But those appeared to not be necessarily super deep. But she also had bruises in various stages of healing. Some wounds were deeper than others, or, the position, whatever. And some forensic experts concluded self-infliction was highly impossible and plausible. It is so
Yeah.
weird. So what actually happened was that, the initial police report stated that Sam broke in the door. While he was breaking in the door, he was accompanied by the security guard of the building. And then the medical examiner who was doing the autopsy on Ellen received this police report. And after initially he classified it as a homicide because she was stabbed to death and all this, after he reads the police report that he was accompanied by a security guard of the building when he broke down the door, he changed it to suicide. And because of that, it wasn't really investigated. A suicide is not being really investigated. And the building manager said that Sam's uncle came in and wanted, to pick up some things from the apartment. And because of that, and because it was classified as a suicide, she felt bad and she didn't want the family members to see the apartment with all the blood everywhere. So she had the apartment professionally cleaned by people that clean up um, crime scenes. So all the evidence, everything was destroyed, everything was professionally cleaned. The uncle comes in, picks up her phone and her laptop. Um, yeah, they didn't collect the evidence, and that also seemed a little odd for me. They didn't pick up the knife.
Yes, because it was a suicide. Or at least, what they thought was a suicide. There was no investigation, so the scene wasn't, sealed off, and sadly, all the evidence was ruined. It was contaminated. And then I think, like, the chain of command was technically broken because when they said it was a suicide, her laptop and her cell phone and everything that his family wanted to get from the apartment, that wasn't looked into. So, with all that taken away, it's not like you can, like, take back and be like, "I'm reinvestigating this. Let me see that laptop." Well, now you can't, really trust anything that's on there. So, the reason I think they quickly wanted to hurry up and grab some stuff was because she was Jewish, and part of the Jewish tradition is that they have their ceremony or the funerals fairly soon. I wanna say hers was, like, the next day or next day or 2, and so that's what the excuse was to in order for them to grab the laptop and, some of her belongings, they said, "Oh, we wanna do this for Sam for her funeral." Whereas in
Uh,
my opinion, I think they were trying to get the evidence that they could, take and contaminate it or, destroy anything having to do with ruling that Sam was in, like, to
yeah,
blame, essentially.
yeah.
But yeah, I can't believe, like, when I found out that the scene was completely cleaned, I was just like, "No!" The whole scene is now ruined, and there's no evidence, and it's not like they can go back and find anything. It was professionally cleaned, so everything is ruined.
Yeah.
But I did appreciate that the building manager, so before she allowed Sam's family to come, she called the police and they gave her the permission. They were like, it's not a crime, so they can take the evidence, whatever. So, and that's when she got in touch with the cleaning people, which she
Yeah.
also, got the permission to do that. And then before she did that, she went around the apartment and like videotaped everything. So
Mm.
I'm like, all right, well, maybe they can do something with that, but I still don't think that was good enough.
Yeah. Yeah. And now that you're saying that, you're right. So the uncle, who's actually a lawyer, so I should also mention that he knows what he's doing. He came the next day and picked up her phone and her laptop and all that. So the apartment was cleaned within a day, pretty much,
Right.
which you're right. The building manager had the green light from the police and they said, yeah, she can go ahead and do that. So it wasn't her fault. I don't want to blame her or anything.
Right.
She did take pictures and videos of the crime scene, which was great. Great thinking on her part.
Yeah, I agree.
However, so what I said earlier, so on the death certificate, I think the official ruling of suicide, and maybe there was like a back and forth in between, then happened in April. So a few months later, after evidence was already, you know, eliminated. Yeah. So, and that also like started this whole struggle, this whole legal struggle Ellen's family has. There was a lot of back and forth. And in one of the documentaries, they say there was even like a struggle when they were talking to the police and they asked for the surveillance videos of the building. And the police was like, what videos? There is no videos. And even that took a couple days to finally get the police to hand over those videos to the lawyers of the Greenberg family.
Yeah. I think early on, I mean, obviously I know, and I'm not against the police, but I think the police took lead on this case and were the determining factor of like her cause of death as opposed to the medical examiner, which I mean, I know they did the initial investigation and they know what they're doing. I don't, fault them for that. But I think when it comes to the actual cause of death, that the autopsy and the medical examiner should be the ones to make that call, but I feel as though the police did in this case.
And he did rule it as a homicide at the beginning until he saw the police report that falsely stated that Sam was accompanied by the security guard of the building when he broke down the door. So that's why the medical examiner concluded, well, if the door was actually broken down and not the latch somehow, fooled with and made appear to be broken down, there was a witness to the door being broken down. So the door must have been broken down. So Sam cannot be the murderer. So they decided to rule it a suicide. And that was all because of the falsely stated police report. And I'm also not necessarily blaming the police because, it was very new. It was on the same day, probably, or the next morning. And the police report probably stated whatever information they were fed from witnesses, from Sam, from, I don't know, I don't think anybody just made up that story that Sam was accompanied. There must have been a misunderstanding maybe somewhere. But that had such huge impact on the case until today. The Greenberg family still suffers until today because of that falsely stated police report that really decided on the whole case.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah. And then, by the way, they must have tested the knife later, and Sam's DNA was not detected on the knife. So that's also an important clue in this case, which we know from other cases. They say, and that's very graphic. So for anybody who doesn't want to listen, fast forward 15 seconds. But when you stab somebody with a knife multiple times, the knife gets bloody and slippery. And that's how usually the murderers cut themselves because they just slip onto the blade of the knife. And that's how usually the perpetrator's DNA ends up on the knife as well. And in this case, wasn't found.
Which is crazy because it's like you live in the same house. So even if he did not commit the crime, his DNA would most likely still be on there just because, walking by or using it or whatever the case is.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It kind of doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah. And then, in the documentary that I watched, uh, I don't know when exactly all this legal stuff happened, but it must have been during the pandemic when they have the original medical examiner in court and they were questioning him and he was dialed in via Zoom. So that's why I assume it must have been during the pandemic, maybe. And he was questioned whether he would have changed his ruling if, the police report didn't state it and all that. And in that hearing, it also turned out that the police came to the medical office. The medical examiner and his boss were in a meeting with the police, discussing the new findings of the case. And there's no meeting notes. They couldn't even remember who was in that meeting and who said what. So that's also very suspicious.
Very suspicious. Make that make sense. Name like any meeting, legally, like has to be documented.
Yeah.
So why was this one not documented?
Yeah, exactly. That is already weird. And then, the medical findings from the autopsy are also in question. As I mentioned earlier, there were different stages of bruises on her body. One medical professional said it kind of looks like she was strangled, which I think the official medical examiner did not come to the conclusion. I think it must have been somebody maybe hired from the Greenberg family. I'm not sure 100%, but it was said that, it appeared like she was strangled. And then also those stab wounds in the back of her neck, one was so close to the spine that even in the court hearing, the professional medical examiner that they had as an additional witness, she said there's three possibilities with this one stab wound. And one of those possibilities is that it numbed her. So she couldn't have stabbed herself after this wound was inflicted on her. So even that
Yeah.
is not completely 100%, concluded.
Yeah. It makes no sense.
So, and then she also said, like, another possibility that she said in the deposition, she said, is that one of those stab wounds may have been caused after her death, which also speaks against the suicide.
Yes. Yes. It's just like, again, not that it's impossible to not stab yourself, but the angles and like doing it, if you do it, it's like, yes, it's obtainable, but it's just not like the natural thing to do.
Yeah.
And yes, that was also found in the autopsy report where it's like, how are you going to justify that then?
Yeah. Only way I can explain it to me is when somebody really has a mental breakdown. Sometimes people hit themselves and all that.
Right. Yes.
That's the only way I can explain it to myself, that she took a knife and just like, freaked out. Because there was
Right.
also one stab wound in the head, which is so weird, but that speaks for my theory that she just freaked out somehow, you
Yeah.
know? And it also speaks to the theory that some of the stab wounds were hesitation stab wounds, not really deep. And there wasn't a struggle. There wasn't a self-defense struggle. Because if somebody starts stabbing you on the back, don't you grab for the knife or don't you? I don't know, you know?
Yeah. So actually when I was listening to the podcast, I think you were right with it was someone hired by the Greenbergs that they determined that uh, they also said that the wounds did not look self-inflicted, especially because of the different directions.
Yeah.
Um and that it actually was more so like a blitz attack where someone was caught off defense wounds because you're caught off guard. There's you have
Yeah.
no time to react. So
Yeah. I know. And then let me read this real quick. This is part of the legal struggle they faced later. And excuse me, I don't have the exact dates here, but this medical examiner's name is Dr. Osborne. And he then took his own attorney. This was going back and forth in the courts, outside the courts. So he then had his own attorney. And the Greenbergs family
mhm.
was willing to settle with him if he came clean. And then that Saturday before the jury selection, his attorney, Dr. Osborne's attorney, says, we have a deal, which completely set up a media storm. And then the media says, quote, he no longer thinks this should be stated as a suicide, and that he had received new information about this case, and that Ellen's matter of death should be designated as something other than suicide, which is, speaking very loudly that the medical examiner on this case then all of a sudden comes to this
Right.
conclusion and changes his mind after all those years. However, with this statement in hand, Ellen's family proceeded to go to court and in a civil lawsuit against the city with the goal to have the matter of death changed legally, which then would, once successful, would start an investigation, although the crime scene is not there anymore, but at least they would start to investigate that case, which is all the family wanted, right? Is to have this properly investigated. And this was actually in February of this year, so 14 years after the death. And the decision was made in a settlement to reinvestigate this case. But then 2 months later, the parents state that nothing has changed, or actually the settlement said they would investigate this case rapidly. I
Right.
think there was a word in there that meant, as soon as possible, quickly. But then 2 months later, the parents state that nothing has changed. The city hasn't investigated anything yet. So they had to go back to court. And then just in October of this year, which is why we're talking about this case, because it's, up in the media again. In October of this year, it was reconfirmed in court that
Very
it was a
disappointing.
suicide.
When the
Super
Hulu
disappointing.
documentary came out, I wanna say it was, like, August or September, I think that's when, obviously, it was more popular in the news and, everyone was putting out their opinions, and I think the Hulu documentary really painted the picture that, yes, she did struggle. Yes, there is a possibility, but for the most part, most likely she was murdered. And, they demonstrate all the examples of, just proving that it was not a suicide. And it's a shame because, 14 years later,
Yeah.
they were given another chance to have this case turned around and, having the homicide listed again
Mhm.
or even just undetermined. And for it to just be a suicide again, it's just, I feel so horrible
Yeah.
for her parents and her family and Ellen. And it's a shame.
I agree. Yeah, I agree 100% with you. And what was I going to say? Oh, yeah, and there's also a lot of videos online and on YouTube, where people demonstrate how easily you can tamper with the door latch, how easily you can close it from the outside so it appears it was closed from the inside and then break down the door. And even the building manager in one of the documentaries said
Yeah.
that it happened to her before. She's seen other neighbors it happen or whatever, that when you slam the door behind you too hard, this latch will close by itself just by slamming the door. And then her as a building manager had to get the door open because, neighbors lock themselves out this way. So, that speaks loudly that maybe that
Yeah.
door latch
I
wasn't
that
closed from the inside. Maybe it was
that's my theory.
tampered with.
That's what happened for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I have another sentence on the uncle's role in all of this, and his credentials. So James Schwartzman is described in the reporting as prominent attorney in Philadelphia and has held positions of judicial oversight importance, for example, being linked to the Pennsylvania Court of Judicial Discipline. So, he's linked to the courts. He arrived at the scene of Ellen Greenberg's death very soon after it occurred. According to one source, he asked the building manager for access to the apartment the next day to get a suit for Sam for Ellen's funeral, and then removed items, electronics, phones from the apartment. He's not reported to have been acting in the capacity of a lawyer for the investigation in the sense of being an official prosecutorial or investigative attorney. His role appears more as a family member relative of Sam, but with legal or judicial experience. The Greenberg family's civil complaint raises the removal of those items by Schwartzman as a potential chain of custody/evidence compromise issue. What's your thoughts on the uncle?
I mean, clearly he's very well connected. He's in the system. He knows the system. So, he knows plenty of people, even if he was, acting as his family member and not, his lawyer. I'm sure behind closed doors that, he was definitely helping him out. I just, They're just well connected, well connected.
Yeah. And I wonder, this is the judgy bitch part. Let me be judgy for a second. I wonder how much influence he has behind closed doors on the judges, the police, they influence the medical examiners. I wonder how much of his influence really played a role in this case. Because as I said, this meeting with the police and the medical examiner's office, nobody knows who was there. There's no meeting notes. Was there never meeting notes, or did they disappear in the file somewhere? And I wonder how much influence that uncle has without wanting to blame him or anything. It's just my thoughts. Um,
Yeah, I think because of his ties into the system and, just having an influence over people, I really think he had a lot to do with the case and or, with the evidence not being released or covered up or anything like that. So in my opinion, allegedly, I don't want to get sued, like I said before. I think he had a lot to do with this case.
yeah, I agree. And let's just entertain the suicide perspective for a second, right? So the door was broken down. There was no evidence of a struggle. There was no self-defense wounds, which is typical for stabbing victims. There was no DNA found on the knife. The
Yes.
the manner of death was the stab to the heart, I believe, in the final documentation, although there was the question if it was caused by the
Yes.
stab in the back, but I think the final was the stab in the heart, I believe. So what's your
Okay.
thoughts?
As someone who suffers with mental health issues, it's hard to not have that idea only because, when you're in that moment, right? Like, so for example, when they're saying, it couldn't be a suicide because she, got gas that day and then she was in the middle of making a fruit salad. But then, and that indicates that they're planning for the future.
Yeah,
And a lot of people say, if you're suicidal, like you really don't think about the future. But when you're in that moment and you're struggling and you're having an anxiety attack, if you're suicidal or super depressed, when you're in that mindset, anything to get out of that mindset or not to feel that pain, you'll do anything. You'll do anything to not, feel that anymore.
yeah,
And although I don't think this was a suicide, I don't want to rule that out as not being a possibility. In my opinion, I think it was a homicide, but because she did suffer
mhm,
from mental illness, I can see how they do paint that picture because, she was on medication. She, vocalized that she wanted to go home because, she was really struggling. Her job was very stressful, and she did go to therapy and had a psychiatrist. So it is well known that she did struggle with mental health issues. But like I said, overall, I do not think this was a suicide, but I don't want to say, there's a 0% chance. Like, I know that kind of sounds like a little contradicting. It's very sad.
I agree with you. I've just been through a surgery, and I got like a fibroid from uterus removed, which then caused my hormones to play ping pong every day. And that caused me to
Hmm.
have all of a sudden one day severe depression. And I can tell from my own experience, it's the voice in your
Yeah,
head that speaks to you every day, right? Oh, let's go to the bathroom,
right.
get something from the kitchen. The voice in your head that talks to you. And all of a sudden, that same voice
Mhm.
says, oh, maybe I shouldn't be here. Like within, a split second, that
Yes.
voice says, pick up that knife and do this or something. It seems so real, and it's so hard for yourself to realize, no, I shouldn't be doing that. So I kind of understand that mental health could have played a role in this case, and it could have been a suicide. I agree with you. It's very, very sad. And I feel so badly for the Greenberg family. And I think what
Right.
they want is they just want it to be properly investigated and come to an informative conclusion, and not just jump to conclusion. They want it to be really determined. And even if it then turns out that it was a suicide, I think they can still grieve and find a little bit of closure, although there probably will never be closure in this case. But, at least they can find a little bit of peace with that. I don't know that family, I'm just assuming, but I think they would accept that if that's the conclusion of the investigation, that it was a suicide. What is a struggle right now, I can imagine, for this family is the just not knowing and just so many questions in this case, right? Just the frustration of why hasn't it been investigated, I think, and why is there so many weird things in this case that we talked about in this podcast? So many
Right.
weird
Yeah,
things
I
that
agree.
happened. Why? That's
Like,
suspicious,
yeah,
you
like you
know?
said, like, I think if they actually had it investigated and then it was determined that it was a suicide, I think if it was properly handled and, they went through every protocol and, really investigated all the evidence, if in a perfect world, they would have did that from the very beginning, then, they might start to, I don't want to say accept it, but more so, like you said, like start to, process it as if it was a suicide. Not accept it, but, accept that it was suicide versus a homicide.
Yeah. 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 I agree with you. Let's just spend some final thoughts on Sam Goldberg, that was her fiance. So it was said that he is now married with children. He has never been prosecuted or even charged with anything. He was never legally treated as an official suspect because of the early ruling of a suicide. Can you imagine you're meeting a guy and he's telling you, so, well, in my past, I was engaged before. Oh,
No, I mean, for me, because I'm a little investigator, like, I Google everyone. Listen, I will find anything out about someone. So he wouldn't even be able to tell me that because I would have already known and, like, no way would I be put in that situation. But I cannot fathom that, like, having that conversation with him. And then, even his coworker on the documentary, he's like, "Oh yeah," and like we still had
no.
to work with them, and people had their opinions or whatever. I forget what the guy said, but I'm just like, if I had someone that I worked with and like the person that I sat next to was, potentially a murderer, like what? There's no way. I couldn't sit next to that person.
Yeah. I mean, Judgy Bitch coming through again, right? But I wonder how you get past that conversation in
Right.
the dating process and still decide to continue dating that guy and then
Oh
even
yeah.
getting married and having children. I mean, he must be very convincing that this was a suicide and he had no fault in it. But I would
I
like to
know.
interview the wife now
Yeah.
after seeing all those documentaries and all those details. I would assume she wasn't fed all those details
Right.
when they were talking about it, just his side of the story, so to speak. So I would like to know if she would change her mind now after hearing it, or if she's in denial on it, or I don't know.
No, I can't picture it just because, like, if that were me, I'd be running out the door like that. Even if it was a possibility, just knowing that, I don't
Yeah.
know. I mean, your feelings must have to be really true love or something. I have no idea.
Yeah, for real. And then what I'm really struggling with on this case is just there's so many questions, right? Like I'm an overthinker and I can't stop thinking about it. And I just ask myself those questions. Why lie and hide all these
Right.
things? Why? So there must be something, which is why I'm a strong believer too that it wasn't a suicide because of all that. And why not, even the police or the
Right.
medical examiners, why not admit there were mistakes made in the
Right.
process, but come clean after all those years now? Just, say there were mistakes made. We're really sorry. Let's start over again. That's what I don't understand. And it smells like corruption to me. It smells like there is something happening behind the scenes that we don't know.
In my opinion, I think there's corruption. But I don't think they want to come clean just because they don't want to admit fault. Who likes to admit that they're wrong or that they, treated the situation poorly? I think they need to take their pride, set their pride aside and, do what's right and give justice to this family because, there's probably other victims out there that have been treated the same. And that's the sad part.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure.
It makes you lose faith in this whole system a little bit, right? Like this family was failed so badly. And in the documentary, they showed it towards the end too, and they kind of said it a couple times that Ellen was the only child of this family. these parents,
I
they
know.
they said it themselves. They will never know what it's like to be grandparents. You know, that just broke my heart. I feel so bad for this family.
Hearing would give them some closure and the
Mhm.
answers that everyone deserved and needed, especially them. But it really crushed my heart for them.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
And they were also talking openly, which I admired about this family. They were so open and honest in this documentary. And they said
Yeah.
this whole case was such a struggle even within their marriage. They struggled for some time. Now they're much better. And I can see that, everybody grieves differently and it's frustrating and you probably let it out on your partner more often than you want to. And I can see this happening. And I just liked how raw they came across and how open and honest.
Yeah. I know statistically, couples who lose children tend to get divorced. So I know, that they mentioned that it was a struggle. And yes, it's
Mhm.
interesting to see that they're admitting that, but that they remained close and, want justice for their daughter. And it's a shame.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm glad that they're doing better now. And it seemed like they also got external help, probably through therapy and all that. And I'm very happy they're seeking out for help and they're sticking together and they have each other to lean on and they're doing better. And I wish them all the best. I hope one day that justice will be served. They will find
Yeah.
out what happened latest in heaven, maybe. I just wish them well. Do you have any final thoughts on this case? Is there anything we didn't mention yet? Is there any more details that you know of?
So I guess just going back overall, like I said before, not that I don't think suicide is the case in this case. Like I don't think it was a suicide. I truly believe it was a homicide. But I don't want to, sit there and say that it's not a possibility just because of her,
Yeah.
mental health history and medication. I
Okay.
don't want to rule out that suicide might not be a possibility. In my opinion, I still believe that it was a homicide. Um, but I think with her mental health history, her being on medication, and his family having ties, that they were able to set the picture and set the tone that this was a suicide. But in my opinion, I just think with all the faults that, from start to finish, between the scene not being closed off, that the crime scene was cleaned professionally, and it wasn't investigated as a homicide, that of course they're painting that picture that it is a suicide. In my opinion, I think her boyfriend committed this crime.
Yeah. It seems like I lost Paige, but thank you so much for listening. Let me know your thoughts on this case and what you think. Was it a homicide or a suicide? And I see you guys next week. Thanks so much. Bye. That was it for today. Thank you so much for listening. And if you are as excited and opinionated as Peanut and me, please give us a follow on Instagram at the Judgy Bitch Pod. And don't forget, please also tell everybody you know about this new podcast so they come and follow us as well. We would much appreciate it. Would you like to be part of it? Sure, go ahead. Send us a DM with your feedback, your hot takes, and your unapologetic opinions. We might read them next time. And last but not least, don't forget, please follow, review, and rate wherever you listen to this podcast. See you next week. Cheers, bitches.